Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast welcomes Dr. Robert Marbut, a fentanyl national expert, former White House homelessness czar, a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, and the senior producer of the new documentary Fentanyl, Death Incorporated. Dr. Marbut, thanks for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed.
Oh, thank you so very much for having me on, and more importantly, thank you for caring about the fentanyl topic.
Well, it's become an increasingly tragic situation in the United States of America, and I'd like to first talk about Fentanyl, Death Incorporated. Tell us an overview about this documentary.
Well, it's a 1-hour documentary. It's very, very fast-paced. Our goal was to get the top 2 experts in each of the separate parts of the fentanyl crisis, everything from international intelligence agency people to fentanyl anesthesiologists, the doctors, to recovery experts, to DEA, to local law enforcement, policy, sheriffs, etc. So we got it all in, and it is literally the most comprehensive fentanyl movie you'll see. You'll get the history of it, how did we get there, the medical aspects, the chemical aspects, the chemistry, the bad policy, everything from China, open borders, Mexico cartels, the biker gangs up in Canada. A lot of people are not aware of how Canada is quickly becoming in the last year one of the number 1 producers of the world, if not number 1. And what that means to have our northern border also being under attack as well as our southern border. So it's a layout of every part of it, but what's real important at the end is we give solutions of what needs to be done from here to get this under control.
There's so much of what you just said that I want to cover in our time together today. And of course, we'll encourage people to watch the documentary for in-depth coverage of all of this. But let's start here. What is fentanyl? We hear the name, but we don't know. Is this a natural product? Is this a compound, a chemical compound? What is it?
Fentanyl was invented for very high-end surgeries in 1959. And in essence, it's jumping from organic opioids to a synthetic opioid. It gets formed in 59, and like, for example, pretty much heart surgery has become possible because of fentanyl. Before that, you had people who would literally die of shock on the table of a surgery. So fentanyl, when properly used in a medical environment, with an anesthesiologist watching you, and you're being monitored for blood pressure and oxygen and heart rate, among many other things, is a very appropriate medicine. But what happened is it first got misused in the Purdue Pharma. Everybody's very familiar with that. But at Purdue Pharma, it was many other people beyond Purdue Pharma, but it was synthetic opioids. The message that was put out by Purdue and others was it was non-addictive, that this, because we've jumped from organic to synthetic, somehow magically it was not addictive. Well, it turns out that was clearly wrong. And that whole by 2012, 2014, you had hundreds of thousands, millions of Americans using, abusing, and addicted to synthetic opioids. Then that's where the Mexican cartel and China come in. When all the lawsuits happened in Purdue Pharma and the doctors stopped prescribing or dramatically reduced the reduction, you had all these people addicted in America. Nobody spent any time dealing with how are you going to unaddict these people who were falsely addicted. There was no treatment plan, no recovery plan, nothing like that. So that's where the Chinese actors and the Mexican cartels jumped in and said, we'll fill that void. We'll give you that illicit opioid in the form of a synthetic, or, sort of lab-made synthetic opioid. And that's how the crisis gets started in America.
Were people using this legitimately and becoming addicted for pain reduction purposes, or were they using it recreationally, or was there a mixture of both?
A little bit of mixture of both, but the initial wave in the United States was the overprescription of pain meds, mostly after surgery. And there was this false narrative that was pushed that it was non-addictive. Not only was it not non-addictive, it was one of the most addictive drugs that was ever made on planet Earth. It wasn't like, it might be addictive, it might not. I sat in a room with a family member, and I asked this question, and the doctor said, no, this is non-addictive. It's a new type of deal. Well, it turns out it was incredibly addictive and incredibly powerful, unfortunately. Fentanyl is so deadly. It's 100 times more powerful than morphine. You can't sort of smell it. You can't taste it. You can barely see it. 2 grains of salt will kill most people. 3 grains of salt, the equivalent of fentanyl, will kill anybody, or 1/15 of a grain of rice. That's how small a dose would be that's lethal. Fentanyl is incredibly powerful. And so when people started going to the street with it, you lost all control of, when it went to the street, it just became so dangerous for a variety of reasons. One is the dosing wasn't correct. It was a mixed batch. It gets mixed and tainted with other things. Initially, it was people who were already addicted through proper medications, if you will, and they were just finding their source. And then over time, you've had recreational drug users come into it. So you've had people through the medical addiction pathway. Then you had illicit drugs, sort of the recreational drug user, think San Francisco. Mm-hmm. And then you had the cross-contamination and lacing group, Kensington, Philadelphia. And what's saddest is the children 0 to 4, in many parts of the country, 0 to 4 children, the fastest growing death rate is fentanyl. And you're like, they don't have drug dealers. Right. And that is just, they have fentanyl dust on a park bench or a kitchen counter of another family member using it, and they put a sandwich down, a hamburger down, and they pick it up and eat it and die. And so that's called fentanyl poisonings. There are 4 different ways to die with fentanyl. I mean, it's unbelievable what we've gotten to, and the house is on fire and nobody's ringing the alarm.
I'd like to explore a little further this claim of non-addictive. Was that a nefarious claim? You mentioned that it was far from the truth. And if they were doing this for deceptive purposes, who's being held accountable for making those claims?
Well, that's where Purdue Pharma, if I remember correctly, their amount was $8 billion, and they pleaded guilty in a settlement, or they settled for that. Many other manufacturers also settled. Doctors, some of the doctors settled. The major pharmacies settled. So when you hear of the opium settlement, it's really a series of settlements. And so in that way, they've been fined. Now, whether that's accountable, you may think, with this killing more than anybody than all the military wars in the last 100 years, you might not think of that as highly accountable, but it has been the repercussion of the fines. To put this in context, if you take all the American men and women servicemen who served in all 7 uniform branches of the military, plus add in a few of the intelligence services with it, more people have died in fentanyl in the last 5 years than all the wars in the last 100 years of Americans of the last 100 years. That means World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War I, Gulf War II, Afghanistan, Iraq, the UN operations, and a few other smaller, all combined did not kill more Americans than what fentanyl has in the last 5 years. This is how deadly this has become. There was some accountability. Now, most people won't think it's an appropriate level of accountability.
This is an astounding number, and I've never heard it put that way before. But in some ways, when people are killed in wars, we keep track of it carefully. We track it, and people are aware of it to some extent. In this instance, it almost seems like a silent epidemic, although I know we're talking about it, but we don't see the compilation of numbers that you just referenced.
I remember as a little kid, and I don't know how old you are, but I remember Walter Cronkite when I was a little kid. In Vietnam, every Friday night, he literally posted how many KIA, how many MIA, and how many wounded. Every Friday, he posted that. That was one of the, and so here's what it is. And nobody's really doing that on fentanyl. Part of it is in some quarters, I don't want to say all quarters, but in some quarters, oh, that's just recreational drug users, so they deserve it. I've literally had people tell me that. Well, first off, this is way beyond recreational drug use. There's absolutely some of that, no doubt about it. 3-year-old children are dying of fentanyl poisoning. Something is really wrong in our country. Something has gone really haywire. And when you have the Mexican cartel, the Chinese bad actors coming in to fill a void that in essence was approved by everybody from big pharma to the pharmacies down to the governmental agencies that approved it, like USDA, and approved this and said it was not as addictive or it wasn't as addictive as, whatever. And it turns out we were all wrong, like way off, like not sort of off, like way off. And we as a society, through the governmental agencies and big pharma and the pharmaceuticals and then literally the pharmacies, addict a group of millions of people because they have pain mostly connected to surgery. They go into the hospital and they depend on a doctor to give them the truth and the honest understanding and say, take this will help you with your pill. People get addicted. In our movie, we have one individual who sort of talks about that process of how he got addicted with a routine surgery. This is way beyond an illicit drug use on a street in a back corner. This is affecting all aspects of the society. And I would challenge most people I know in the last year I've talked to know somebody now who's died. If you talk to people 4 years ago, I heard Tom Petty died or something like that. You heard a celebrity die of it. But there wasn't a personal. Now, just in the last year, almost everybody I talked to has some family story or a friend story about somebody very close to them who's died. And they were like, they didn't. It was just sort of like sometimes it's one and done. Fentanyl is so powerful. If you take the wrong dose on your first use, you can die.
We should talk at least briefly about Tom Petty and Prince, because I'm not sure people really understand what happened in those instances. Were they deliberately using it? Was it accidental in those cases?
Each of those, and you have Little Peep, and you got probably another dozen or so pretty famous entertainers. What disturbs me, like I was reading the Tom Petty sort of obituary news story, rereading it the other day. They go through and almost celebritize, glorify this whole thing, and then nearly second to the last, I think it was the second to the last paragraph, was Tom Petty was found in a hotel room in Las Vegas, overdosed on a fentanyl and a mix of some other things. And I think we should be using these celebrity stories, sports, entertainers, whatever. I think we should be honest about it and up front. First or second paragraph in these stories, it should be drug overdose, and died because of fentanyl. Yeah. And here's how dangerous fentanyl is. Instead, we glorify the person and barely mention it, rather than saying, let's use those sad stories and get the information about how deadly this is. And each of them are a little different. Many of them now have mixes. Apparently, Prince was more of a pure fentanyl. From everything I've read and the medical documents I've read, that seems to be a more pure, just fentanyl overdose. And was interesting because there was a doctor involved in that one. In Petty's case, it was a mix of fentanyl was the main cause with the mix of some other stuff. I think we should be using these as sort of learning moments, not sort of glorifying moments. the people who are dying, in my opinion. I know other people may differ on that. But that we're in the middle of a crisis, an existential threat to our country that we've never seen before. And probably this is the scariest time since World War II in terms of a death rate of anything. And we're not acting like that.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues in a moment with our guest, Dr. Robert Marbut.
Online at shillingshow.com.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
ShillingShowMedia.com will take your project from conception to completion.
ShillingShowMedia.com is reasonably priced and highly professional.
Need a website for your business? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Need a video created or edited? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Have a photography or graphic design project? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
Visit ShillingShowMedia.com. That's ShillingShowMedia.com.
Looking out for us. Rob Show.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Our guest is Dr. Robert Marbut. He's the senior producer of the new documentary Fentanyl, Death Incorporated. I want to go to China in particular and start there. What is their motivation? Is this money, or are they trying to subvert American society, or both?
Well, I think in the China case, it was one individual, and we talk about this in Fentanyl Death Incorporated. One guy gets this idea in the early teens, so 2012, 2013, 2014, and he gets the idea that China fentanyl that was already being made there for medical purposes could fill the void of what was happening with the Purdue Pharma as people were being just cold turkey taken off of these prescriptions. For him, it was all about money, the guy who did it. And then he took the idea to the cartels to be the retail wholesale distributor, to get it wholesaled across the southwest border, and then get it into the illicit retail market. For them, it was all about money. And so I think in the beginning it was all about money, but then over time, why the Chinese government has not cracked down on it is they're saying, hold on a second, we bring cash to our country and it destabilizes an adversary. So they're like, hey, win-win here. And I'm not sure they started off with the idea of destabilizing the government or destabilizing American society, but they now totally understand it does, and they're allowing it to happen. And part of this movie, I spent almost 3 weeks in China, and I went to all the big major cities, rural areas. I went out in the middle of nowhere, went into just back alleys, and you don't see fentanyl on the street like you see it in American cities. In San Francisco, you can walk out of any hotel and see fentanyl within 1 minute. In China, after everywhere I went, I only saw 4 people on drugs of any kind, and 2 of them were fentanyl. And fentanyl, you always know because it's called the fentanyl bend. You're bent over, and you think a person's going to fall, but what happens is fentanyl paralyzes your chest cavity, your sort of torso, and you're sort of frozen and you rock, and eventually you fall down. But for probably 20, 30 minutes, depending on how much you take and how much they're absorbing into their blood system, you see a person just rigid and bent over. It's the weirdest, it's like the zombie apocalypse, just like you're looking at a real life version of this. If this is not for movies, and you look at a person in the videos and you go, and anybody could go look up fentanyl bend and you look at it and you go, how does that person not fall over? But it's because of the paralysis of the chest cavity.
So you mentioned San Francisco, and it's interesting to me that they don't seem to be doing anything about it. Is there government complicity in all of this? They just not want to get involved? Why is it like that there and probably other places?
San Francisco, and to a certain extent, Philadelphia, and I will say the new mayor of Philadelphia has reversed course from her predecessor. Mm-hmm. But San Francisco still continues to, in the genre, it's called harm reduction. And the idea of harm reduction is we're going to try to help make the supply safe. That's what the theory of harm reduction is. And in San Francisco, in our documentary, we did another documentary, Americans with No Address, where we did it, and we feature this in the movie, that the San Francisco County and City Health Department set up a safe consumption site right downtown, like a block and a half from City Hall, near the FBI and DEA operations. And they set up a ring, like a mesh fence, like you see, like a country club mesh fence. And they said, come in here and you can do any drugs you want. There was no treatment provided, no recovery provided, no access to it. And they spent about I think it was like $26, $27, $28 million a year on this project. And it was called a safe consumption site. Government gave you your paraphernalia to do your drugs. They gave you the pipes. They gave you the foil. They gave you the Narcan. They had people there to monitor you there, and foil and straws. I have a mantra that I, for the team I work with, is we right now in America are making it so easy to get high and so hard to get treatment, and we have to flip it on the head and make it easy to get treatment and hard to get high. And when a government entity, and in this case San Francisco, and to some extent California, comes along and says, we're going to make it easier for you to get high, and we're going to pay for it with taxpayer dollars, what planet have we come off of? I mean, we have just lost our way. We should be using the opioid settlement money to get more treatment beds, not providing the drug paraphernalia. And that's what we're doing now in many parts of the United States. And we're decriminalizing wholesale operations of fentanyl and meth. That makes no sense whatsoever.
Does this look likely to change under the Trump administration based on the proposals for people in key positions?
Absolutely. Help is coming. We're days away from a new leadership team. President Trump, I think, has probably talked about fentanyl every day on the campaign trail. I mean, every rally, every time I heard him on radio, I heard him somewhere, somehow talk about fentanyl. We now have somebody who understands we're in a full-blown crisis. In the last 4 years, the White House didn't act like we're in a full-blown crisis. It was like, oh, here we got another policy issue, and it's called fentanyl. We're in a crisis. We're not acting like we're in the middle of World War II. That's what we should have been doing the last 4 years, and President Trump will do that. And I think a lot of people on the left say illegal crossings at the border, people without proper documentation. There's this idea that that's somehow a right-left thing. Let me tell you directly what an open border has done for fentanyl. First, you have to understand the Mexican cartels are a multifaceted, multi-vertical business operation. They do illicit drugs, they do sex trafficking, human trafficking, coyote service work to get you across the border, and they do fentanyl. So they have 5 major product lines. And so when a person comes across the border, the cartels will say, we'll cut your price down $1,000 or $500 if you take this bag across with you and meet the van on the other side. So the people actually crossing are being asked to carry it in order to get a cheaper discount for the service of getting them across the border. So one is the people coming across that we don't know anything about are actually carrying it. That's part one. Part two, and we cover this in the movie in a really good graphic that our graphic people came up with, they flood a zone. And humans flooding an area take a lot more effort rather than a technology of having to process people, gather people, give due process, feed, take care of. So they'll, like, say, flood Laredo zone. So they'll send a lot of people across. And then the agents, even Texas local law enforcement, state law enforcement, will all go to that area and contain that area. And then further down in McAllen or over in Del Rio, you walk the fentanyl across the border because there's no agents there, because they've all had to shift over to this area that's been flooded. And then the third area is our northern flank now is very vulnerable because we've had to reallocate people to the southwest border. We also have stories of people being in the different governmental agencies on the northern Canadian border, and they're, quote, on the border, they're in their office, but they're really on a Zoom, and they have a secure platform. It's not Zoom, but they got their version of Zoom. And they're processing people on the southwest border. So you're using northern agents to process southwest border, and they're not out doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is watching the border. They're in their office up in the northern border, but they're spending 8 hours a day processing southwest border people crossing. And that is just unacceptable. And that's how this problem with we need to know what comes across our border, illegal drugs, and we need to know the people coming across if they're a bad actor. We have to know that in order to have a secured country.
Finally, Dr. Marbut, what are the signs of hope? I know we just talked about the incoming Trump administration, but are there other signs we could look to?
I think two good things. President Trump has all sorts of good people around him who get this and are going to take action. They're not going to navel gaze. They're going to get going right away. So that's number one. And number two, of all places, I'll point to California. California had been on a decriminalization for probably 2 decades. And the state legislature had been passing a variety of bills that decriminalize drug selling, especially at the sort of wholesale and large retail area. The citizens of California, led by a couple prosecutors who wrote a bill, a citizen initiative, they voted almost 2-1. I think that, they're still voting, counting votes in California, but it looks like it's going to be about a 2-1 overthrowing of the legislature's decriminalization, that the citizens of California, liberal California, has said this has gone too far and voted 2-1 to recriminalize high-end drugs. That, to me, is probably the best thing I've heard in decades, is when California citizens are rising up to say our legislature has gone bonkers and wonky, and they've gone all wokey here, and they've gone to the far left. And when they're reclaiming common sense, that's exciting.
It certainly is. Dr. Marbut, if people would like to watch the documentary Fentanyl, Death Incorporated, or to follow your efforts online, tell us how, please.
Right now, we are streaming on Salem Now. You can go right now to salemnow.com, and in 90 seconds, you'll be in the movie. At the start of the movie, I did it the other day myself. It was fabulous. We'll have some other streaming platforms in first quarter 2025, and Warner Brothers is distributions helping us with that. Our website, Fentanyl Death Incorporated, you can go there and get some more information. We have a lot of facts on there too. So either of those locations, and we'd encourage that the movie was really designed for parents and children and policymakers. So if you're a parent, if you're a child, if you're a policymaker, you'll find a lot of information in the documentary, and really hope people will go out and watch it.
I hope they will too. It's such important work. Dr. Robert Marbut, thank you so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thank you so very much for having us and really caring about fentanyl. Really appreciate it.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at shillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.